went to Arusha to try and find out more about the UN tribunals. Everyone's heard about the Rwanda tribunal, and as an academic, I thought I should know about it too. When I got there in June of 2003, I met my client. Seemed to be a decent enough sort, and then the chief prosecutor, Carlo Del Ponte, had a press conference in which he announced publicly that the former president of Rwanda, Habyarimana, had been killed by the current president of Rwanda, Kagame, and that the UN was ready to prosecute Kagame for that crime and to prosecute the RPF forces under Kagame who had committed crimes. And this came from the chief prosecutor. I was stunned. I knew nothing about there being another reality to the Rwandan genocide story. I expected it to be the same story all of us had heard. But after the prosecutor announced this world-changing, in my mind, event, Paul Kagame called for her to be removed from office the next day. Not surprising. But what was surprising is I was sitting at the bar in the Impala Hotel watching CNN. Colin Powell was responding to questions about the search for the weapons of mass destruction in the summer of 2003. And while I was sitting there trying to decide whether I was going to take a case, Colin Powell described to the rest of the press in Washington that the weapons of mass destruction would be found at any minute now. Just please wait. We know they're there. Of course, we know that that wasn't exactly true. But also during that press conference, he was asked a question about Kagame's call to have Carla Del Ponte removed from office because she recommended prosecuting him. Colin Powell said, yes, we agree with that policy, and went on. Probably no one in the world caught that except a guy sitting in Arusha, Tanzania, trying to decide whether he was going to take a case in the tribunal when the day before the chief prosecutor had just told him and the rest of the world that the story about the Rwandan genocide that they had heard was untrue, and that she had the evidence to prosecute Kagame and the evidence to prosecute the RPF, and Colin Powell was calling for her resignation. 2 months later, she was removed from office, and no one associated with the side that won the war has faced any charges at the UN tribunal at all in the last 16 years. That means that the Rwanda tribunal by the UN is either a victor's tribunal, like the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals after World War II, or the Rwanda War, 5 years of it, which preceded the Rwanda genocide and continues afterward. Either it's a victor's tribunal, or this war has been the only one in history in which only one side committed crimes, because that's what the UN tribunal has decided, in spite of the fact that the chief prosecutor knows that that's not the truth. So, as a result of that work, as a defense lawyer at the tribunal, I got discovery from a prosecution that was not using any UN documents to prosecute the defendants, although the UN had people in Rwanda during the entire period of the genocide, and was issuing daily reports on what was going on. None of those reports were being used to prosecute the people who were being accused of crime. When I was able to get the documents that had been accumulated about what was happening between UN headquarters and the airport, which is where my client had his command responsibility, I found out that none of the documents that the RPF or that the prosecutor had that related to that area where my client was the commander. Those documents, it took a year for me to get, and finally the documents showed that in fact there were no reports of crimes being committed by my client or by his troops in that area. Moreover, he was the guy that the UN had to go to every day, many times a day, in order to get to the airport to do their work. And there was nothing but laudatory comments about my client in the UN reports. Now, I understood why the UN reports were not being used by the prosecutor. And I set out to get more reports. And I was able to get into UN headquarters. I'm the only defense lawyer at the ICTR that has ever been able to do that. And I've been able to put together a document file of some 30,000 documents that are on the website, RwandaDocumentsProject.net, that had the effect of bringing into the ICTR evidence about what actually did happen in Rwanda day by day, almost minute by minute, that have been in the UN files since they were created in April through July 1994. And except for my being able to get at them, they've been completely suppressed for the last 16 years. Because I was able to get at those documents, I was also able to show that there's another explanation for how this mass violence happened, because it is true that mass violence happened in Rwanda. It means many people were killed because they were Tutsi. Many people were killed because of their ethnicity. But what the UN documents also show is that there was a war that had been going on for nearly 5 years. The country was completely destabilized, and at the end of 1993, the military of the country next door, Burundi, assassinated the Burundian president, who was the first elected Hutu president of Burundi, and the country exploded. 250,000 people or so killed, probably. 1/3 coming into Rwanda. All of these in October of 1993 to the end of 93, as Bob Flotten was just ending his term. The reality is that the State Department understood quite well that if the Arusha Accord ceasefire was broken, that was preventing war in Rwanda, that the events in Burundi would have caused Rwanda to explode, as an example for Rwanda. So what we now know is that the current president of Rwanda, Mr. Kagame, was warned beforehand that if he broke the ceasefire, that he would be responsible for mass violence of a communal nature, like happened in Burundi, would also happen in Rwanda. We now know, because of the revelations of the former Secretary General of the ruling party of Rwanda, Dr. Rudasingwa, that, of course, that assassination by Mr. Kagame of Habyarimana, in fact, did happen and led to the mass killings that we know about. But it's a complicated question, because people got killed for lots of reasons. And our purpose here today is to begin a process of truth and reconciliation in Rwanda that has not been able to get started up until now, because knowing the truth has not been possible. The documents have been suppressed by the UN. The story about what happened in Rwanda has been distorted by the U.S. because of their own involvement, in my view. But where we are now is that a new day is going to have to start in Rwanda, and we have to start this new day in Central Africa also, because as you know, there's violence in the Congo today that's related to this assassination and the politics that led to that. The invasion of Somalia that's going on today by forces of Burundi and Uganda are part of this story. The human rights peacekeepers in Darfur are Rwandan troops that are taken from the eastern Congo, where they're stealing minerals to the tune of about $250 million a year, and then sent from that operation up to Darfur to be peacekeepers in Darfur. The entire region of Eastern Africa has been affected by this assassination in ways that have changed the history of Eastern Africa. This is the first meeting in history, after these disclosures and this evidence has been put into the record, in which leading members of each side of this struggle, Hutu and the Tutsi side, are meeting in public to acknowledge that both sides are responsible for the violence, that both sides committed crimes, that both sides have to accept responsibility and go forward to reconciliation based on the idea that everyone had a piece of the Rwandan genocide. So this event is really not for those of us in this room. This event is being simulcast worldwide. It's the first time that people in Rwanda, people in the Congo, people in Burundi, people in Uganda, people in East Africa are going to find out for the first time how it was the Rwandan genocide actually began, and that the responsibility does have to be shared. There are no good guys and no bad guys absolutely in this matter, except in my view, for United States policy. Because the evidence also makes clear that at the time that the crimes of the RPF, or portions of the RPF, because as Theogene mentioned to me, of course, it wasn't everyone, that's true. But it's been clear that the U.S. has known about this since September of 1994, and that they've systematically covered it up since that time. And we have the cable to Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, that explains both the revelation and cables that show the cover-up later. So tonight, we're going to make use of that research by making history by having a first meeting in which truth and reconciliation for Rwanda can be discussed. But to get at the truth, we have to get past a problem. The problem is that if anyone in Rwanda, or anyone who is from Minnesota who goes to Rwanda, who has written an article saying, you know, the way the government is explaining how the war happened is not true, that means that that person is a genocide denier. Well, you heard that applied to me when I was arrested in the summer in 2010. But of course, if genocide denier means denying that the violence occurred and that it was terrible and it was awful, it makes no sense. But if genocide denier means differing with the way the government said that it carried out the war and how the government said all the violence happened, it's clear that the evidence does not support that story anymore. So that means all of us on the stage, to the extent that they're willing to consider an alternative, are genocide deniers. They would stand with me in the dock in Rwanda just the way that my former client, Victoire Ingabire, is in jail, on trial today in Rwanda based on charges that are trumped up with documents that no one has ever seen. It means that to the extent that we're not careful with security, our lives are not safe either. Kagame has put out a dead or alive order for me. Paul Rusesabagina, something similar. Dr. Rudazingwa, also something similar. I think, and Bob Flotten has been accused of being a gun runner for the genocidaires by the U.S., by the Rwandan ambassador to the U.S. So you should know that these are the kind of people who are in front of you today. The program I'm going to turn over to my colleagues, and we are very fortunate to have Prime Minister Ali Guled here as the moderator. Prime Minister Guled served in the Somali government for many years, was at the Humphrey Institute here for the last 7 or 8 years. But his perspective is the perspective from the region as to how this mistelling of the Rwandan genocide story has affected the politics of the entire region and is actually affecting politics in Somalia today. That'll be part of the contribution, but he will be the moderator. I sit down. The first speaker that I'm going to ask to address us will be Robert Flotten from the U.S. Ambassador to Rwanda, who was in Kigali in the years 90 to the end of 93. He will be explaining his take on it. We have Paul and Theogene will be talking about it from their viewpoints. Since Paul already spoke this morning, he's going to speak less now and will be leaving early. And the rest of us will continue the conversation. But the important thing for people here in this room to understand is while it seems like there's not a whole lot of people in the audience, it's not a big roaring event. Of course not. Earlier today, we had people from the Rwandan government here challenging us and calling Paul, what did they accuse you of being a terrorist, I think.
Well, I'm a terrorist, I'm financing terrorists, I'm a genocide denier, I'm a negationist, I'm a genocide ideologist, everything.